On today's show, is Fred VanVleet holding Jalen Green back offensively? And Ime Udoka addresses Alperen Sengun's slow start. It's all coming up on today's Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Thursdays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets, where the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Drop us a comment while you're there. Give us your thoughts on the episode, or just do a drive-by. Say Go Rockets. It helps us out a ton. And also be sure to subscribe to our new daily Locked On Rockets newsletter. Now, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And as always, thanks so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you so much for being one of our awesome everydayers. Joining us now is your weekly co-host, the podfather himself, Rockets Wire editor and host of the Logger Line podcast, Ben DuBose. You can track down on Twitter at Ben DuBose. And Ben, we got a handful of topics that we're going to get into on today's show. The one that I think is at the forefront of discussion amongst Rockets fans, mostly because we just saw a Rockets win in which Jalen Green played pretty well and Fred VanVleet did not play. And there's this topic that pops up every so often about, is Fred VanVleet holding Jalen Green back? And so I feel like this conversation is going to dominate a majority of our show today, because I actually dug up some interesting stats that were shocking to me when I looked at them. And so I can't wait to kind of share them with you and with our audience. But just from the jump, right? I'll lead with this, just say, I don't think Fred is holding Jalen back, but I can understand maybe some of the arguments behind it. How do you feel about just the general tone of this conversation?
I think I would agree with the framing that another high usage guard is potentially holding Jalen back. I do not agree with the framing that Fred is holding Jalen back. And what I mean by that, we've talked for years on this pod about Jalen being something of a rhythm player. And the more he gets touches, the more he can feel his way into a game and build confidence, the better he is, at least in terms of the totality of his contributions. And I think on some level, if he gets to 20, 25 or 30 points a game, as he did Sunday against the Clippers, then at some point it does make him more dialed in with the other elements of his game as well, the defense, the playmaking. And so overall, you get a better player. However, I don't think that it's unique to Fred VanVleet. I think the fact that the Rockets don't replace Fred with another guard, they basically put Ime Thompson, who's more of a wing on this team, and then use Jalen as the lead guard in that lineup when Fred isn't out there, sort of plays to Jalen's rhythm. But I think it's a problem that would be there no matter who the other guard is, assuming it's a guard of relatively high usage and not just Fred. And if you look at the efficiency, and here's where I really struggle with this idea that Fred's holding him back. So there have been only 2 games this year, small sample size, of course, but it's all we have, where Fred didn't play. And Jalen's averaging about 24.5 points per game in those 2, but he's shooting just 43% from the field and about 32% on threes. So it's not like he's all of a sudden a wildly different, a much more efficient player. No, he's just getting more volume. And on some level, if the counting stats tick up enough, if he's dialed in and used enough offensively, does it potentially make him a little bit better in other areas? I can buy that, but I don't think that Jalen is so good at that level of efficiency that it's worth the trade-off of taking someone like Fred away from your team and all of the clear benefits he gives you, such as limiting turnovers, getting Sengun involved, and so on and so forth, just for the slight bump in Jalen Green. I guess what it all comes down to, for me, Jalen is not at the level of player that you would cater your system to him to that extent. He's a better player, at least a little bit, when Fred hasn't been out there this season, but the difference isn't so stark that you would do something drastic and say, you know what, I've got to do this because getting this version of Jalen Green is worth it. It's a little bit better, but Jalen isn't just so, transformative, so transcendent in these outings without Fred that it's worth making a change that drastic. And I would note that a lot of this with Jalen just comes down to the matchups. These two games without Fred came against opponents, the Wizards, who are just dreadful, and the Clippers, who the Rockets seem to match up very well against 3-0 this year, that have been favorable. And so some of it may not have
Clippers without James Harden also.
Yeah,
and
too.
Other key players.
Yeah. And so some of it could be just small sample size theater and matchups that are favorable to Jalen no matter what. If we go back to last March when Jalen took off and looked like one of the best players on the planet for a month, Fred was out there pretty much the entire time. So number one, I think some of it is small sample size theater. And secondly, even though Jalen is better, or at least has been better in the limited samples we've seen this year without Fred, I don't think the gap is so large that it would dictate how you put this team together. It helps Jalen a little bit. That's nice, but it doesn't make Jalen so damn good that you say, you know what, I've just got to do this no matter what.
I think it's a really great way to try to kind of start unpacking it all. And there's still a lot more to get to. And again, I want to get to these numbers here in just a moment. We'll unpack the numbers in segment 2. But my reaction to it, first off, when you said, right, Jalen isn't transformative enough to cater, the whole system to or whatever. And yet Jalen still leads the team in field goal attempts and usage. So like the team is catering to Jalen to an extent, right?
Somewhat,
to where he is, getting a majority of the shots. He's getting a majority of the opportunities. Where I would immediately push back to anybody who thinks that Fred is a negative value asset or is holding Jalen back is to highlight here, Jalen's been given an abundant amount of opportunities away from Fred VanVleet, right? Like Ime intentionally throughout portions of the season has staggered those two guys to where they don't share the court at the same time. And in those minutes, Jalen is often or oftentimes would be sharing the court with guys like Thompson, Tari Eason, Reed Shepherd, one of the backup bigs, or Jabari Smith Jr. as a small ball 5. That is a lineup where it's do or die for Jalen Green, where he has the opportunity, where he is the lead guard. And for whatever reason, it seems to me the biggest thing that I see when Jalen is playing without Fred in games where Fred is just literally not suited up, he's in street clothes, is Jalen has, I feel like, a different mentality in those games. Yeah. Where he understands, okay, Fred is not here. He's not here to bail me out. He's not checking back in a couple minutes. I can't fade into the background. I have to be the guy. I have to be the guy breaking down the defense. I have to be the guy getting downhill. I have to initiate the offense. And that plays into some of the rhythm element for sure. But I wonder how much of that can be brought back to Jalen when he's playing games with Fred, right? Because we've seen the substitution pattern where Jalen comes out early in the first quarter at the 6 or 7 minute mark and then checks back in late in the first quarter or top of the second, and then he's running the second unit. But to me, he should still be able to get into a rhythm doing that. It just comes down to a mentality thing for me.
Yeah, and I would also say with Fred, remember that this is a different version of Fred VanVleet, at least theoretically. Now, it's varied some from game to game, but this is a different version of Fred than a year ago. The Rockets are trying to lean on him a little bit less in terms of playmaking duties so that guys like certainly Sengun, but to a lesser extent, Jalen, and maybe a little bit Jabari as well, who's come on of late, can do more of the heavy lifting, and certainly Ime and Tari when they're in the game. So this idea, we've always said that on paper, Fred is an ideal off-ball guy as he, gets into his 30s, and maybe he's not as quick as he once was, but he can still space the floor. He's high IQ. He shoots really well when he's truly open. It's in a spot-up capacity. Well, it's not like you can flip that switch overnight. And so some of what's happening could also be Fred sort of having to feel his way into a new role as well when he becomes more of the complement and Jalen is the primary. But I agree with you that it's mostly about Jalen. And that's why I let off my comments saying that I really don't think it's about Fred. I think you would be going through the same conundrum no matter who is out there at point guard. If it's not Fred, if they're starting, Aaron Holiday, Reed Shepherd, basically any traditional point guard, and then you take them out and you make it to where Jalen is the only true guard, lead guard on the team, because I know Amen technically entered the NBA as a point guard, but that's not really how the Rockets are using him. Let's be real about that. They are replacing, when Fred is out, they are going with a lineup that basically is Jalen, 3 forwards, and Alperen Sengun. And so when it comes to initiating the offense, when it comes to late in the clock bailout scenarios, yeah, you're exactly right. It's not, is it my turn or is it his turn? Who's going to be the guy? No, Jalen knows I'm the one guy who is truly trustworthy enough with a guard's handle and a guard's shot. A men's shot is getting better, but especially beyond the three-point arc in areas that aren't the corners. We know it's not there yet. Jalen, there's a much more simplified thought process for him when Fred isn't out there on the court. And so from that perspective, I can buy that it's easier for Jalen, but I push back at making it about Fred because I feel very strongly that the issue would be just the same, if not worse, if it was another guard that's not Fred VanVleet that's being in and out alongside Jalen. It just so happens that Fred is the guy on this team.
Coming up, want to get into some of these interesting lineup numbers concerning Jalen Green, Fred VanVleet, Alperen Sengun. Going to get there, as well as some assist numbers between those three guys that kind of popped when I looked them up. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5, just $5, and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything that you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one spot. So if you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the exact same page where you actually place your bets. Just go to FanDuel.com to join today. And while you're there, take a look at all the different odds available. Check out their parlay builder, check out the different season awards, season leaders, division winners, or the outright favorites to win this year's Super Bowl. Right now, the Detroit Lions plus 270, the Chiefs plus 500, the Eagles plus 550, the Bills sitting at plus 650, and then rounding out the top five, the Ravens plus 1,000. So for all those odds and so much more, head on over to FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch or make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, Ben. So I looked up these numbers because I was genuinely curious. I was like, okay, well, I see this argument. I see some fans saying, okay, well, Fred's holding Jalen back, all this stuff. And so I went and looked at the actual, net rating lineups and seeing, okay, how do these guys perform in certain, duos, trios, whatever, when they're on the court. So when Fred and Sengun are both on the court and Jalen's off the court, the Rockets have a staggering 24.72 net rating in about 158 minutes played. That is very, very impressive. Now, when Jalen's on the court and Fred is off the court and Alp's still out there, so Jalen and Alperen lineups, the Rockets have a plus 13.66 net rating. Still very respectable, not quite as good as the 24.72. And then we get into these interesting lineups where you go down and you look at, okay, well, what happens when Jalen Green is the only one on the court? So, right, we've talked about those bench units, right, where Jalen's the one who's supposed to be running the show with Ime and Tari and Jabari, or one of the backup bigs, and Reed Shepherd. Those lineups have struggled considerably this season. So when Jalen's on the court and neither of Fred or Sengun is out there with him, the Rockets are posting a minus 4.85 net rating. So those lineups are losing their minutes ultimately. Now, I looked at that and I thought, okay, that kind of tracks, that matches the eye test here. The Rockets have been abundantly better when Fred and Sengun are out there. And to the points that you made earlier, right, there's that dynamic, the two-man game between Fred and Sengun, right? Fred is so good for Sengun. He feeds him the ball. Yep. He gets the team settled. He limits turnovers, all the things that he brings to the table. However, I did look at this, and I want your thoughts on these assist numbers. Fred has only assisted Jalen Green 9 times this season. Can you believe that? 9 assists.
Wow.
On the entire season. And
I knew it would be low, but that's really low.
That's really low, right? So by comparison, Fred has 38 assists to Alperen Sengun. That's his leading, assist guy. He has 26 to Jabari Smith Jr., 23 to Dylan Brooks. He has 12 to Ime Thompson and 14 to Tari Eason. So Jalen literally has the least amount of assists from the lead ball handler on the team. So again, I don't know if this necessarily feeds into the narrative that Fred's not helping Jalen or whatever, because part of it is definitely Ime's had them staggered through portions of the season, right, where they haven't shared the court a ton. But 9 assists is just ridiculously low. I'm trying to wrap my head around it.
Well, I'm guessing you haven't looked up the amount of assists that Jalen has to Fred.
I have it right here.
Okay.
Jalen to Fred, only 6 assists.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, so I think a lot of this, the reason I asked that, for me, it comes down to how they've structured the offense. I think, and perhaps this is an area for Ime Udoka and the coaching staff to try and improve over the next few weeks. But I think generally speaking, so the possessions where you run through shin hub, if you will, we know how that works out. And so you're using the guards often as spacers, and you're wanting someone to cut baseline, usually someone like Ime, Tari, or Jabari, at times Jalen, but we've seen him do it more with the forward guys that have a little bit more length. I would say when either Fred or Jalen is involved as one of the primaries, i.e. a pick and roll, or maybe it's just isolation early in the shot clock because it's one of the possessions they're playing with more pace, it doesn't seem like in those sets as well that the other guard is actively involved off the ball. It sort of seems like, perhaps there's some value as a spacer, at least in Fred's case, because I do think he brings a ton of gravity as a shooter. I don't know that Jalen really does. I mean, he's not a terrible shooter. A lot of the numbers for Jalen come down to shot selection, but he's not clearly an above average shooter either. But just as with Sengun, you see more of the forwards doing the off-ball movement. I think that same dynamic plays out if you pay attention off the ball when Fred or Jalen is one of the primaries in a given set as well. And so because of that, the Rockets are looking much more to those guys who are trying to cut to the rim. And with Jalen in particular, because he's not that great of a shooter, if he does get the ball beyond the three-point arc, he's not making a ton. And sometimes if he gets the ball, well, we know Jalen's sort of a rhythm guy, so many times he won't shoot immediately. He'll take a couple of dribbles. And so because of that, it sort of takes the assist off the table. But I think the bottom line is the way the Rockets have structured the offense, it seems like the guys who cut off ball and do a little bit more motion aren't really out of the backcourt. It seems like with how Fred and Jalen are used, it's a little bit of your turn, my turn. And I hate to use that because some people think of it like, the James Harden, Chris Paul years in terms of one-on-one ISOs. It's not really that, but in terms of, how you're initiating these pick and rolls or whatever the action is, it does feel like the other guy is just sort of sitting there and saying, well, for the most part, this isn't my possession unless it's late in the clock and Fred needs a release valve or vice versa. And so I think that's what's going on here. It's not so much that Fred's not looking for Jalen. I think it's that when, Fred is initiating that pick and roll with Sengun or whoever it may be, that the guys that the Rockets are trying to free up off the ball are much more in the Tari, Amen, and Jabari tier than it is Jalen. For whatever reason, they're using, the guard that isn't involved is much more of sort of a release valve, break in case of emergency, if you will.
No, and look, this is where this is how I want to loop this whole conversation back. Is I really think the issue is much less about, like you said, right? It's not about Fred specifically. I think it's just an issue with the base scheme of the Rockets offense, right? And the way that it's set up is everything is so heavily predicated on that initial action, the pick and roll, the two-man game between Fred and Sengun. And to your point, right, those two guys, and the numbers back this up, right? Those two guys have been elite together when they're on the floor. So I think Jalen also suffers, unfortunately, from the fact that Ime has basically attached Fred and Sengun at the hip to where those two guys play a majority of their minutes alongside each other. And when they're out there, right, it's almost like you're doing yourself a disservice by parking Fred in the corner and letting Jalen run that two-man game with Sengun. Even though it's been productive, even though it can look good at times, it just hasn't looked as good as the two-man game between Fred and Sengun, right? For all the reasons we've already listed out, Fred's ability to hit that little pocket pass, to find Sengun on the roll, to get other guys involved, all these little things. And I come away from it just thinking that, I don't know how the Rockets could, I guess, better utilize Jalen at this point, because we've seen Ime try a few different things, right? We've seen Ime, most recently, Ime's been pulling Alperen Sengun out of the first quarter early and then coming back with Sengun to be the guy to lead the second unit. So now Sengun is the anchor for the second unit lineups, whereas, Jalen and Fred are now being paired together to kind of close out the first quarters as like the backcourt, running mates or whatever. He hasn't really settled in on a true identity for this team yet offensively, and I think that's kind of the whole crux of the argument here is Jalen has opportunities. He has moments where he can look really good, where he's, able to run, be the lead guard, run the offense, get the ball to Sengun. He has, I think 18 assists to Alperen Sengun on the year, if I want to make sure that number's right. Assists to Alperen Sengun. Yeah, 18 assists to Alpe. Far and away his favorite target to hit for assists this season. But he's just not afforded as many opportunities. And I think that's where Rockets fans need to understand, hey, yes, it could look good, right? If you were completely removed Fred from the equation, it could look good. Jalen could run the offense full time, but things would also look uglier, right? There would be the high turnover games. There would be a lot more sloppy play, but would that stretch, right? Would that be worth it, right? To give Jalen and Sengun 6 months, half a season, a year, whatever it would take for them to be the focal point of the offense without Fred, without the training wheels. And could you get past that to an area of like greener pastures where Jalen and Sengun could cut down on the turnovers, where they could get to a place where, okay, it's closer to the production level of the Fred Sengun two-man game?
Yeah, and I will throw an asterisk on your comments. I won't say that there's nothing they could do, but the juice isn't worth the squeeze for what we talked about off the very top, which is building your entire offense around Jalen Green. Yes, you can make him a little bit better, and I think you can make him improved in a few areas, but the version of Jalen when Fred, like Sunday, isn't out there at all, it's better than what he is in the aggregate. But is it so good that you toss all the other strengths of your team to the wayside to try and play to that? No, he's a little bit better, but it's not worth retooling your entire scheme. Jalen is not that transformative to your outlook. So while there is something you could do, in my opinion, it's too drastic. The one thing that I would say, I wonder how it would look if you had a movement shooter out there and you were able to use Jalen Green a little bit more off ball. Because I think what ends up happening is that the way this system is built, I mentioned the three young front court guys, Ime, Tari, and Jabari, and typically having two of them out there and, sending those guys towards the rim or trying to crash the offensive glass and using whoever the other guard is as something more of a spacer, a shooter, a release valve. I think if you had another movement shooter out there with Fred and Jalen, and I know, Dylan's a good three-point shooter overall this year, but I don't think you'd call him a movement shooter by any stretch.
No, not at all.
Right. And so I think if you had a movement shooter and they were something of the release valve for, sticky situations late in the shot clock, and then perhaps you could use Jalen a little bit more off ball, where even if he's undersized, we know how explosive he is when he's going downhill towards the basket, then that could at least unlock the Fred Jalen connection a little bit more. But then to do that, you would need the shooting, you would need the spacing in a way that, the way this team is built right now, they don't really have. I don't think Dylan's that type of guy. Aaron Holiday is, but I think he's just too small. If you're trying to play Fred, Aaron Holiday, and Jalen Green against most teams, you're just too small. Same goes with Reed Shepherd. If he can find his stroke, I still don't think it's that easy to play Fred, Reed, and Jalen all together based on the lack of size. So in theory, if you eventually acquired, let's say, a 6'5", 6'6" movement shooter, then you could perhaps use Jalen a little bit more off ball and perhaps get more out of him in that way. But I think the way the team is currently built, beyond just the stylistic preference of Ime Udoka, I think they're also boxed in a little bit just based on, the personnel of this group.
I do think on that note, I wonder what Gary Bird's up to these days, right? 6'5", 6'6" movement shooter. No, I kid. Look, those were some dark days for Rockets fans. This throwback to the MVP chance in Toyota Center.
Yeah, I saw someone bring that up. Yeah,
I know, right? Look, I do wonder. Again, it comes down to I think there are maybe some different things that the Rockets could do offensively. I've gone back to a lot of times thinking about the Sacramento Kings style of offense and how they use Sabonis in those kind of pistol actions, DHO handoffs, but they don't do it on the perimeter, right? When they do DHOs with Sengun, they do it on the perimeter. They do it at the 3-point line. And for a team that doesn't really have a ton of great outside shooters, it kind of devolves into just a lot of like, okay, handoff. Did you get a switch? Was there a little bit of a seam for you to get a downhill attack? If not, then it devolves into isolation play sort of, or they call back the screen and then they go back and they try to attack again. If you were to try doing DHOs at the elbow, right, and maybe some like split cut actions and whatnot, then you could get an opportunity where Jalen could catch the ball and immediately turn the corner and be right there at the free throw line to elevate for his mid-range jumper, or getting downhill, right, only one or two dribbles, with that explosive first step, and he's right there at the rim. I think that would afford the Rockets a little bit more maybe creativity in their offense. And again, we know that Ime is not a coach that's lauded for his offensive ingenuity, offensive creativity. He's definitely given this team an identity. He's made them a competitive team, and they're clearly one of the best defensive teams in the NBA. I'm not quite to the point of some Rockets fans who are clamoring for like Ime to hire like a lead offensive assistant, a la kind of Mike D'Antoni relying on Jeff Bzdelik to quarterback the defense all those years ago. I'm not quite to that point yet, but the offense has left a little bit to be desired this season, and I am curious to see what more some of these guys could achieve in a different looking offensive system.
Yeah, and I do think that some of this is just based on personnel, to reiterate the point that I'm making. It's not that Ime can't make improvements, but when we talk about using Jalen in a capacity similar to how, or at least I've talked about using him similar to how those front court guys are used off ball right now, well, you look at the three that I've mentioned, Ime, Tari, and Jabari. Jabari is the only average to above average shooter. So with Ime and Tari, it's not so much that you're choosing them over Jalen. It's that, well, if you park them in the corners and you use them as, floor spacers, well, you're not even going to get value from that because they're not good shooters. You have to use them in that way. And no, you're not going to take them off the floor because they are so insanely valuable in other areas. But in terms of half court offense and unlocking the best version of Jalen Green, yeah, you are sort of boxed in by who the Rockets need to play based on, the totality of their contributions. And overall, Ime and Tari are great players, but it does limit a little bit of what you can do when you're trying to run them and, Jalen, Fred, and Sengun. Well, Jalen almost has to be used in certain ways because it's not like you can turn to Ime and Tari and say, wow, you're going to, space the floor this possession for Jalen, and let's get him going by, doing a backdoor cut and letting him go downhill, because you're not going to have the floor spacing anyway. So that's a part of this. It's not, black and white. Again, there are some things they can do better from a coaching perspective, but some of it also just comes down to the broader construct of the roster, and that limits a little bit what Jalen can do.
Coming up, Ime Udoka addresses Alperen Sengun's slow starts, as well as Cam Whitmore in the doghouse. What's going on there? We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. Look, with big wireless providers, what you see is never really what you get. Somewhere between the store and your first month's bill, the price you thought you were paying magically skyrockets. With Mint Mobile, you'll never have to worry about gotchas ever again. When Mint Mobile says $15 a month when you purchase a 3-month plan, they absolutely mean it. Say bye-bye to your overpriced wireless plans, jaw-dropping monthly bills, and unexpected overages. Mint Mobile is here to rescue you with premium wireless plans starting at just $15 a month. To get this new customer offer and your new 3-month premium wireless plan for just $15 a month, go to mintmobile.com/lockedonnba. That's mintmobile.com/lockedonnba. Cut your wireless bill to $15 a month at mintmobile.com/lockedonnba. $45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Speeds slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited plan. Additional taxes, fees, and restrictions apply. See Mint Mobile for details. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now, Ben, we know that Sengun's had some slow starts over these last couple weeks or so, really getting off to, just these slow starts in games, not waking up until the third or fourth quarter at times. And he's had some really impressive performances late in these games, but that's been a bit of a concerning trend. Ime addressed it. He was asked about it after the win against the Clippers. Let's hear what he had to say.
We really discussed that pretty much at length, before this game. Our day off at UCLA, we really watched the film and talked to him about getting off to a better start. Felt he was a little sluggish in the Sacramento Golden State game and even some other ones throughout the year, and just wanted him to get off to a better start and really put his imprint on the game from the start. And so he took that to heart. I think he adjusted a few things pre-game with his preparation, and it showed tonight.
You talked before the game about all his different improvements, but given where his skill set is as a player, what sort of growth do you envision from now through the course of the season?
Just continue to be a physical presence on both sides, but really my thing is to concentrate on the things you can control, which is, looking to score and not looking to get fouled as much, playing through contact and not looking for a call or letting missed shots affect you on the other end. And so they went after him tonight, anytime he had it in the post, and he found guys, and that was the reason we had those wide open looks. And so some nights it's going to be a scoring thing, some nights it's going to be facilitating, and he has to be able to do both. But my biggest thing with him is I say to him, get the European out of your game and play through stuff. Stop crying.
Ime is absolutely ridiculous. Play through stuff. Stop crying. What a great line. I'm gonna have to go back and add that to the soundboard eventually. Look, it's so funny because I feel like this conversation around Sengun and some of his slow starts, and maybe this bleeds into his lack of efficiency around the basket this season too. It kind of goes back to, I remember having some of these discussions around James Harden back in the day, right? Is sometimes I feel like players who are so innately gifted when it comes to being able to bait fouls and draw fouls and get to the free throw line, they focus a little bit too much on that element of the game rather than just playing the game, rather than just trying to make the shot, right? Worrying about, they're so focused on, okay, how do I, get the bump? How do I draw the contact? How do I make sure this guy fouls me and then go for the shot, as opposed to just, no, I'm going to make the shot, and if they foul me, cool, I'll get the and one, or I'll get the free throws, whatever. And I wonder if that really is kind of maybe the mental component here of some of Sengun's, obviously the slow starts that Ime addressed, but also just the lack of efficiency around the rim in general this season.
And I also think Ime is raising this point because of the Warriors' problem specifically. And we know Golden State is coming up Wednesday night in the Cup quarterfinal match, which we'll see if Fred's available for that game. Pre-game injury report will come out Tuesday afternoon, I believe. But regardless, to beat the Warriors in that type of setting, and I assume Steph Curry will be available this time, you're going to need something close to peak Alperen Sengun. When you look at the two games the Rockets have lost to the Warriors this year, Sengun wasn't even out there in the fourth quarter and overtime of that first game when the Rockets nearly rallied back on the back of Thompson and Tari Eason when they nearly came back from that 30-point deficit the game in Houston. And then last week in Golden State, Sengun had the dreadful start. He eventually got it going in the fourth quarter, but by that point it was too late. The Rockets had dug a little bit too much of a hole. And I think, at least some of the problem with the Warriors, and I said this ad nauseum after Thursday's game, is mental. In that, okay, the 15-game losing streak, which is now the longest active streak against any one opponent, maybe that's a little exaggerated based on 10 of the losses coming in the Stephen Silas tanking years. Okay, but they're 0-5 under Ime Udoka. And the last 3 losses, offensively, it's been brutal. You look at the one that ended their season last April, they fell behind by 20 early. You look at the one in Houston last month where they scored just 40 in the first half and were down by 30. You look at this game in Golden State where, the offense was bad. The only reason it was semi-close is the Warriors did not have Steph and Draymond, so they couldn't score at the usual level that they do. A lot of this comes down to the Rockets have bad body language when they see those jerseys. There's, especially for a younger team and younger guys specifically, I think there's a mental side to this. And so I think hopefully Sengun got some confidence going late against the Warriors, but I think Ime's comments, look, if they're going to win this game on Wednesday night, I think Sengun's going to be the guy that they have to ride. Jalen's been very hit or miss of late, but I think while Jalen is a high variance player, I don't think he's going to be the guy to break out, at least not at a 30 plus points per game level, against a defense as strong as Golden State's. We've seen most of Jalen's big games have come against lesser defenses, and the game against the Clippers, it's a good defense, but it's a favorable matchup for the Rockets for a number of reasons. And as you said, there's no James Harden. For the Rockets to get past the Warriors, who are a strong defense, a team that for whatever reason matches up well with them, they need Sengun to win some of those matchups with Kevon Looney, but they also need him to finish at the rim and make shots that he connected on in the fourth quarter in San Francisco, but missed throughout the first 3. And so, it certainly ties back into the season-long trends of him not finishing as well as he should at the rim. But I also think these comments, look, when they play Wednesday night, how they start that game is going to be massive. I think we'll know by the end of the first quarter or have a good idea of how that game is going to turn out. Have the Rockets turned over a new leaf? Are they ready to sort of turn the page, or is this more of the same? And so who's going to be the guy to step up when the pressure is on, when it's on national TV? You need peak Alperen Sengun. And so I think that's why they're focusing on this. Yes, it ties back into the season as a whole, but I also think for Golden State specifically, and that's who's coming up, and you've got 2 games in the week against them, you could easily see them down the road in the playoffs as well. This is a clear problem for them, not just tactically, but mentally as well. And to me, Sengun is the one guy who clearly has the cleanest path to moving past it.
Yeah, Sengun is clearly, you know, at this point, he's the Rockets' most consistent offensive force over the course of an entire 4-quarter game when he doesn't have those slow starts, right? And that's why it's imperative for him to be able to get off to a strong start, have a good opening, you know, stretch of whatever it is, whether it's, you know,
get
just
the vibes right. Yeah,
exactly. Feed him early, right? And I think the other thing is, the Rockets can't be dissuaded by, okay, if he misses his first, you know, 1 or 2 buckets against whoever's guarding,
keep going to
Devon Looney.
That's part of it too.
Right. Exactly. You've got to continue to feed him because he will find it eventually. And I do think, you know, that's one of the downsides, back to talking about the offensive hierarchy, the structure of the kind of, you know, everybody eats equal opportunity, whatever. No, sometimes you're going to miss your first 2 or 3 shots, right? You need a chance to kind of break out of that little initial slump or whatever. And I do think the Rockets at times can maybe, okay, Sengun missed a couple shots. Let's go to Jalen now. Let's go to Jabari. Let's go to Fred. Let's go to Dylan. And that can kind of make it a little bit harder, take a little bit longer for a guy to get in rhythm as a game goes along. But we ran a little bit longer on today's show than I wanted us to. We spent a little bit longer on the Fred Jalen discussion. So we're gonna have to pocket the Cam Whitmore doghouse topic for another day. We'll revisit that one. Also, Ben's camera is freaking out if you're watching on YouTube. It's incredible.
It was so good for the first 2 segments. Now
It was. You know, you're the inverse of Alperen Sengun. It's near. We're in the 4th quarter. We're in crunch time. You're not showing up. You know, come on. You got to be like Alpi and show up in 4th quarter and OT. All right, Ben. You know the drill. Let everybody know where to track you down at.
Yep, Ben DuBose on Twitter, RocketsWire, and the logger line on the same, and rocketswire.usatoday.com for all your daily Houston Rockets news coverage as I buffer my way out.
That's going to do it for another edition of Locked on Rockets. Be sure to share your thoughts on the Fred VanVleet, Jalen Green discussion, Alperen Sengun slow starts, all that good stuff in the YouTube comments. And remember, the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Drop a comment while you're there, and also subscribe to the new daily Locked on Rockets newsletter. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to having you back right here at Locked on Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.